Adel Iskandar is an assistant professor of global communications at Simon Fraser University, the author or editor of numerous books, and is involved in many scholarly activities.
I think I'm going to spend my 10 minutes talking about what I think Edward Said's. I mean, obviously, it's impossible to ascertain and really describe the impact that Edward Said has had and how much of an incalculable loss his death and untimely his death has been. I think to a large extent we've been at a loss, even though he's left us an incredible oeuvre full of highly sort of charged and compelling writings, both from the intellectual as an intellectual project, but also as a political project. We're still nevertheless missing him in a substantial way in terms of addressing and speaking to the day-to-day demoralizations of all of the movements that we are part and parcel of, whether it's Palestine or the larger Middle East, in American militarized interventionism, even in terms of thinking and understanding the political economy of communication, and the manner in which media systems are no longer in our control, with few exceptions, thanks to the type of work that David has been pursuing. But I also cannot begin to describe the current situation and where we are. So what I'm going to do instead is to focus on what I think Edward Said's project might be all about and what our take-home messages might be. Edward Said, much like a lot of Palestinians who found themselves displaced, disenfranchised, and estranged from their ancestral homeland, lived much of his formative years and adulthood and and spent most of his intellectual project in exile. And exile became a really important part of how he defined himself, perhaps inadvertently, or it wasn't necessarily by his own design, but he sought power and strength within exile. We often think of exile and dispossession, particularly when in the context of Palestinians, as a sort of an amputated experience, of a very violent action that leaves us with no room for either sort of intellectual enlightenment or resistance. But quite the contrary, Edward Said saw exile as precisely the locale for resistance. He used a few words. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna throw them as like a. Never mind. I'm going to use a few of those words just to familiarize you with, and I'm not trying to draw your attention to this because these are jargon terms, but I think they have incredible intellectual salience and political munition embedded within them. The first word that Edward Said was very much fond of was the term contrapuntal. And counterpoint, or the term counterpoint, which comes from musical tonality, and those of you who might understand or know music will understand where he's coming from. And he was a very avid musician and a pianist, a phenomenal pianist. Not at the concert level, which I think is something that he would have liked to pursue had he not continued in his current path. But admittedly, towards the end of his life, he was able to forge an incredible collaborative project called the West Eastern Divan that brought together young Palestinian and Israeli and Arab musicians to perform together in an orchestra under the support of Maestro Daniel Barenboim, who became a lifelong friend of his and someone who eventually ended up inhabiting the Saidian method in significant ways. But for him, the term counterpoint meant that contradictions can exist in a complicated, harmonious way, in the sense that you can have a dialogue and a discussion between Palestinians and Israelis who find themselves very much at odds in a very confrontational manner. And this conversation is an extremely fruitful one. It's fruitful because we can all eventually find a common ground and common ground is not meant from the standpoint of relinquishing or compromising on justice, but rather to understand the justice-based parameters of the two experiential narratives. And I think that is a beautiful part of Edward Said's legacy, is bringing, perhaps appropriating or borrowing this term from music and introducing it in both the literary tradition and the political project. The other term that I thought that I saw that I believe is one that Said was fond of, and I think is incredibly salient, is the term apogee. And the term apogee is a term that is often used to describe the farthest point that a planet or a moon, an orbiting body, is from the object that it is orbiting around. So when we are at the farthest point as a planet from the sun in our typical orbit, that is our apogee. And apogee presumably is the farthest distance you are from homeland, from origins, from familiarity. So if you depart from your ancestral homeland, or if you've been dispossessed and driven out of your ancestral homeland, the distance that the farthest you travel is often seen and considered as a state of absolute weakness and dispossession. Said saw it quite the opposite. He thought about it almost in terms of like the apex of civilizational progress. So as individuals, the farther we are from that locus of origin, the more ingenuity, the more creativity, the more intuition we have in responding to the challenges that exist in our day-to-day lives. Which is exactly why Edward Said believed that when reflecting on exile, we begin to understand ourselves in a completely different modality the farther we are from home. So that's why he believed that Palestinians in the diaspora, of which there are millions, it is precisely their dispossession and estrangement that gives them remarkable strength and agility and intellectual wherewithal to be able to confront imperialism and empire in a manner that very few can. Which is why he invites us all, even though we may not have experienced what Palestinians have in their dispossession, but he invites us to also embrace exile and to embrace what it means to be in this state of apogee, as far away from what we have come to accept as givens, whether they are identities, creeds, whatever it is that we take for granted as part of who we are. We need to take a break from that and go on a long trip to understand what it means to be outside of place, outside of home, and outside of the familiar. And in that, we have a completely reimagined cosmopolitanism. Edward Said was interested in cosmopolitanism, not just because he was a product of it. David described how impeccable his attire was, and you're absolutely right. And that was also a function of a cosmopolitan elite experience that he grew up in, but he began to challenge this notion of cosmopolitanism outside of politics. If cosmopolitanism isn't going to bring us closer, but rather create these entrenched identitarian separations along ethnic, religious, political, and economic lines, then it's not only are they not going to serve our purpose, but they're also going to further disenfranchise us and lead to more loss of emancipatory power. So Edward Said has had a huge impact on so many different academic disciplines, on so many people, on so many projects and movements, but his experience was largely cut short. There was so much that Edward Said could have and should have and would have wanted to offer us. I think the last term that I also, or actually, let's say two quick terms. How much time do I have?
We
We're just at 10 minutes, so I'll give you.
We're at 10 minutes? All right, a couple minutes? All right. So 1 minute per term. The other term that I think Edward Said embodies in complicated ways and started describing in his latter writings was the term amateur. And we often think of amateurism as oversimplification, naivete, and it's a state that one needs to depart as soon as possible, that there's such an emphasis on expertise and having a complete command of everything that you're doing. Edward Said believed that once an individual pursues pursues the understanding of a topic or a subject matter or a project or a political cause, but perhaps even when it comes to, I mean, he was interested both in music and literature, so in those specific areas, to have an absolute command would inadvertently lead the virtuoso towards the amateur state. So the most incredible form of amateurism is that which allows us to be completely agile and working outside of the conformist, rigid categories and structures and institutions. But to reach that state where we can shake those institutions, we have to understand how they operate, we have to historicize. So one of the incredible things that, I mean, when you read this book, for instance, Culture and Resistance, and it's a phenomenal book because it is the product of conversations between two pillars, you know, and you know, you belittled your own intellectual capacity, David, but it's amazing to see the discussions around history and politics in this book. But this is a circumstance where you've got two virtuosos having a conversation. And this conversation, because of their virtuoso state, can venture into the almost the impossible to imagine. And that impossible to imagine is precisely the amateur state. It's the amateurism that you see when you talk to, for instance, young, children, and they have this sort of fantastical notions. And these fantastical notions are precisely why, when you look at Oslo the morning after, it sounds utterly irrational. At a time when everybody in the world is saying, this is a perfect deal, it's phenomenal, there's sovereignty, there's land, land exchange, there's, some degrees of authority, we were talking about territorial exchanges, I mean, and the arming of Palestinians by international, authorities for the purpose of administering this. I mean, when Edward Said comes out and says, the Palestinians got nothing, that is it sounds amateurish. But it is precisely this amateurish analysis that is a function of the virtuoso state that Edward Said had accomplished. And I think that is an important point to take away. And the last term is the word secular. And I think it's important for us to understand what that term means for Edward Said. When we think about secularity, we often think of the world outside, or experiences or worldviews outside of religion. For Edward Said, secularity meant agility and the challenge of dogma. Edward Said despised dogma in all of its forms. He despised the manner in which dogma pigeonholes and forces people into categories that in no means are capable of subsuming or explaining the remarkable experiential universality of the human spirit. And that is precisely why secularity is a challenge to any and all dogmatic thought. So when Edward Said, one of the great interviews, many interviews that Edward Said gave, including many of the interviews with David, Edward Said demonstrates the extent to which he was prepared to be the first to challenge Palestinian nationalism the moment that Palestinian nationalism merges with sovereignty. He said, if there is a Palestinian state, I want to be the first to critique it and deconstruct it from the standpoint of the problematics of nationalism. Okay. So I think that's another really important term that Said left us with. He left us with so much language, but this language has both meaning and impact. And afterwards, I want to read you a quick poem by Mahmoud Darwish about Edward Said. Thank you.